Okay, it's been teased at the end of the 2 previous episodes, and finally, it's going to be time to talk about planes. Planes is one of those things that people love to talk about when it comes to sculpture, and it's something I get a lot of questions about. Planes are complex, and many are quite hard to observe. However, there is an easier way of dealing with planes. Having a rudimentary understanding of planes and what we would like to have happen really helps, of course, but like most things we do in sculpture, it's going to come down to drawing. Imagine a scenario where this point in space and this point in space are not accurately drawn. The plane in between them cannot be correct if this is the case. If drawn poorly, the plane becomes incorrect by default. By placing these 2 points in space correctly, drawing it well, the plane in between them becomes correct by default. Okay, so this one's pretty obvious and pretty easy. We can of course, however, extend the same line of thinking to any other part of the profile, or any other part of our sculpture for that matter, and the result would still be the same. Draw it well, and the plane becomes correct by default. Because it can be so easy, we can start with the profile and it will provide us with a lot of useful information that we can use to help dictate other planes later on. It certainly gets a little bit more complicated than that, however. From this high point on the skull, which we established from the front, to where the form ends, here, we have a turning of form, and by the virtue of this, we're going to have several planes, several faceted planes. By having these 2 points placed well, drawn well, the planes will turn by default from one to the other if we connect this area with clay, these 2 points with clay rather. Broader areas like this are a little harder to read compared to more narrow areas, but in general, a slow turn from this high point to this internal high point or to any other points that follow the same logic is going to work pretty well. A plane I find is often misrepresented is this one here. This one usually becomes an issue because of a poor start. By not placing the chin and the brow at a proper angle to each other, the muscle section of the face, the muscle form, becomes depressed too far back into the skull. This doesn't leave us the room for this plane here to face at the correct angle towards the light. It usually ends up being too vertical. The mouth doesn't catch enough light as a result, and the forms that exist within the plane becomes very flat and unappealing. This issue can obviously be dealt with just by making sure the angle between the chin and the brow functions well at the beginning when we make the profile from the side view. Since we are on the topic of tricky planes to get right, Let's talk about a few more, and hopefully you can keep an eye out for those on your own work. The planes associated with the forehead are tricky for many, and again, poor drawing is the culprit. The issue tends to stem from placing the form of the temporal ridge, here in red, too far forward in relationship to the profile of the forehead. Instead of having a forehead, then, with planes aiming back in space, turning back in space, we get a forehead that has a flat section that's way too broad. Accurately judging at what rate this plane turns back in space is something that's ambiguous at best. The fact that it turns back in space, however, is not very ambiguous. We know that to be true. This means that only one of these issues should be labored over to achieve a competent portrait. Let's say there's a hierarchy, and the fact that the plane does have depth to it from one point to the next needs to take priority over exact observation of how and at what rate the plane turns. Again, drawing is the thing that will solve your issue here. We've been talking a bit about eyes today, so let's talk about a plane that's very often misrepresented in the eye. Again, poor drawing is the reason this plane becomes faulty. You can see here that from this point at the bottom of the eyelid to this point at the front of the cheekbone we have depth. This depth is going to be important. This depth is clearly represented by the upwards facing plane of the bag underneath the eye. The difference in height between these 2 points, or the length of this plane, provides a certain amount of clarity to the fact that there is depth here. We spoke earlier about the tendency to shorten the height of the eye socket. Usually this is going to be something that occurs from below, as the bottom edge of the eye socket is much more ambiguous than the top edge is. Shortening this space by pushing the bottom of the eye socket up makes the plane of the bag underneath the eye much shorter. This muddies the water in regards to the direction of said plane considerably. A longer plane will seem much more clear to us, while a short plane is going to be much more difficult to read visually. Poor drawing left to right from the side view, placing the bottom eyelid too far forward, for example, forces this plane to become more vertical. Pushing the bottom of the eye socket too far back does the same thing. I think in the case of this plane, it's partially the fault of the area being ambiguous and tough to observe on many models. Not everyone has as clear planes as we find on Stefano here. It's also a lack of understanding of anatomy that causes this issue. If we overlay a skull on Stefano, you'll see that the eye socket encompasses not only the upper and lower eyelid, but also the bag underneath the eye. The opening is actually quite a bit larger than what you perhaps might expect. So by not understanding or knowing this, and by misplacing the lower edge of the eye socket, we end up with planar issues. Problems you run into with planes are almost always going to be issues with the accuracy of your drawing. This means you should always look for the cause of planar issues by looking for inaccuracies in your drawing. It can be really big issues that's been neglected from the beginning, like not having the muscle form protrude as much as it needs to. It usually protrudes more than you would think, by the way. It can be smaller and perhaps more manageable issues, like the bottom edge of the eye socket having creeped a little bit too high, or a misplacement of a cheekbone. Trying to force a plane to fit and sit at an angle where it doesn't want to sit is usually a futile endeavor. Instead, you should look for mistakes in your drawing. You're likely to find the cause of your planar issues there.